In the midst of the injustice of a false accusation, a pastor questions God, but a miracle completely changes the judgment. He approaches and the morning sun painted streaks of amber across the Texas sky as Pastor David Thompson unlocked the doors of Hope Harbor Shelter. The old building, once a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Pine Grove, had become a beacon of hope under his care over the past 15 years. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread welcomed him. Miss Martha, their volunteer cook, always arrived before dawn to prepare breakfast for the residents. David paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of the dining hall where dozens of round tables filled the space. Each morning, these tables hosted not just meals, but conversations that changed lives. The walls, painted in warm earth tones, displayed photographs of success stories, men and women who had found their way back from the brink, their smiles testament to the shelter's mission. "Morning, Pastor David," called Jerome, one of their long-term residents who helped with maintenance. His deep voice carried across the room as he mopped the floor, his movements deliberate and proud. 3 months ago, Jerome had arrived broken and hopeless. Now, he was 2 weeks away from starting his new job at the local hardware store. "Good morning, Jerome. How's that job training manual coming along?" David smiled, hanging his jacket on the coat rack near the entrance. "Almost finished, sir. Miss Rachel's been helping me with the computer modules after dinner. Never thought I'd be learning about inventory management at my age, but here we are." Jerome's laugh echoed through the hall, warm and genuine. David's heart swelled with pride. Rachel, their computer skills instructor, had volunteered at the shelter since losing her husband 2 years ago. Like many of their volunteers, she had found healing through helping others. The shelter operated on this principle, that in lifting others, we ourselves rise. Making his way to the kitchen, David found Miss Martha orchestrating breakfast preparation with military precision. The 70-year-old widow had been with the shelter since its inception, and her cooking had become legendary in Pine Grove. "Pastor, you're just in time to test these biscuits," Martha said, pulling a golden tray from the oven. The aroma of butter and fresh-baked bread filled the air. "And don't you dare tell me you've already eaten." David accepted a warm biscuit, remembering the day he first shared his vision for the shelter with Martha. It had been during one of the darkest periods in Pine Grove's history, when the closure of the lumber mill had left hundreds unemployed. The town had been drowning in despair, and the old warehouse had stood as a symbol of their economic decline. "Remember that first morning we opened?" Martha asked, as if reading his thoughts. 7 people showed up, and we only had coffee and day-old donuts from the grocery store. David nodded, letting the memory wash over him. "Now look at us, serving 300 meals a day and running 12 different rehabilitation programs." He glanced at the weekly schedule board hanging on the wall, filled with activities, job training workshops, addiction recovery meetings, financial literacy classes, and spiritual counseling sessions. The shelter had grown beyond his wildest dreams, but it wasn't just about the numbers. Each person who walked through their doors carried a unique story of struggle and hope. David thought about Michael, a former executive who lost everything to addiction before finding his way to Hope Harbor. Now sober for 3 years, Michael ran their financial literacy program, helping others rebuild their lives. As the morning progressed, residents began filtering into the dining hall. David knew each face, each name, each story. There was Sarah, a young mother of 2 taking online classes between shifts at the local diner. Thomas, an Army veteran, was teaching art therapy sessions twice a week, finding healing through helping others express their pain through painting. During morning devotional, David stood before the gathered community, his voice carrying the weight of experience and compassion. "When I first felt God's calling to start this shelter, many thought it was impossible. They said one person couldn't make a difference in the face of such overwhelming need. But standing here today, I see proof that with faith, nothing is impossible." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had become family. "Each of you is proof that second chances are real, that no matter how dark the night gets, dawn always comes. And sometimes the greatest miracles happen in the lives we touch along the way." After devotional, David retreated to his small office, its walls covered with letters from former residents. Each one told a story of transformation, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of despair. He picked up a recent photo of the shelter's first graduation ceremony, 28 people who had completed their rehabilitation programs, standing proud in their caps and gowns. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. "Come in," he called, and the door opened to reveal Pastor Marcus from First Baptist. The two had worked closely over the years, with Marcus's congregation providing vital support to the shelter. "David, my friend," Marcus said, his face beaming. "The board just approved the funding for the new vocational training center. We're breaking ground next month." David stood, overwhelmed with gratitude. The vocational center had been a dream for years, a place where residents could learn trades and build careers. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. This town needs Hope Harbor more than ever." As Marcus left, David sank back into his chair, offering a silent prayer of thanksgiving. The shelter had started as a simple calling, a whisper in his heart during a midnight prayer session 15 years ago. Now it stood as a testament to what faith could build, one life at a time. Outside his office window, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting its light across the shelter's vegetable garden where residents worked together, planting seeds of hope in more ways than one. David watched as Jerome showed a newcomer how to prepare the soil for planting, the simple act of nurturing new life becoming a metaphor for their own journeys of renewal. The calling that had brought him here had never wavered, even in the face of countless challenges. Each day brought new struggles, new stories of pain and loss, but also new opportunities for grace and transformation. In the faces of those who found refuge within these walls, David saw the very purpose of his life reflected back at him, to be a channel of hope in a world desperate for second chances. Little did he know that his own test of faith was approaching, a storm that would shake the very foundations of everything he had built. But for now, in this moment of morning light and shared purpose, Hope Harbor continued its mission of healing, one heart at a time. James Riley stood before the bathroom mirror in his run-down apartment, hardly recognizing the gaunt face staring back at him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once strong frame had withered under the relentless grip of addiction. 6 months had passed since he'd walked away from Hope Harbor shelter, and each day since had pulled him deeper into the abyss he'd once fought so hard to escape. His hands trembled as he splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the remnants of another sleepless night. The morning light filtering through the cracked window revealed scattered pill bottles and empty promises. On the counter lay the latest reminder of his descent, an eviction notice, its harsh red letters announcing he had 3 days to leave. Memories of his first day at Hope Harbor flooded his mind. It had been a crisp autumn morning, 2 years ago, when desperation had finally overcome his pride. He'd stood outside those doors for nearly an hour, watching people come and go before Pastor David Thompson had approached him. "Sometimes the hardest step is the first one," David had said, his voice warm with understanding. "But you don't have to take it alone." That day had marked the beginning of what James had thought would be his salvation. The shelter had offered more than just a bed and meals. It had provided structure, purpose, and, most importantly, hope. Under David's guidance, James had begun to rebuild his life, piece by broken piece. The rehabilitation program had been intensive: daily counseling sessions, group therapy, job training, and spiritual guidance. James had thrown himself into recovery with the same intensity that had once fueled his successful career in finance. Before addiction had torn his life apart, he'd been a rising star at Pine Grove's largest investment firm, with a beautiful home and a future full of promise. "The past doesn't define you," David would often say during their one-on-one sessions. "It's the choices you make today that shape tomorrow." For 18 months, James had embraced those words. He'd become one of Hope Harbor's success stories, mentoring newcomers and helping with the shelter's financial education programs. His knowledge of banking and investment had proved invaluable in teaching others how to manage their money and rebuild their credit. But beneath the surface, shadows still lurked. The stress of responsibility, the weight of expectations, and the constant battle against cravings had worn him down. One evening, after a particularly challenging group session where a new resident's story had hit too close to home, James had found himself in his old neighborhood, outside the house of his former dealer. "Just this once," he'd told himself, "just to take the edge off." That single moment of weakness had unleashed an avalanche. Within weeks, he'd drained his savings and lost the apartment he'd worked so hard to secure. Shame had kept him from returning to Hope Harbor, even as his life crumbled around him. The thought of facing David, of seeing disappointment in the eyes of the man who had believed in him, proved more terrifying than the prospect of homelessness. Now, staring at his reflection, James felt anger rising in his chest. Why had the program failed him? Why hadn't David seen his struggles? The rational part of his mind knew these thoughts were unfair, that his choices alone had led him here, but addiction's whispers twisted everything into darkness. A sharp knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "Riley, rent's past due." The landlord's voice carried through the thin walls, followed by more aggressive knocking. James sank to the bathroom floor, his back against the cold tiles. His phone lay beside him, showing missed calls from his former counselor at Hope Harbor. They hadn't given up on him, even though he'd given up on himself, but the shame was too great, the hole too deep. Through the haze of withdrawal and despair, a plan began to form in his mind. He'd overheard rumors about the shelter's funding during his time there, whispers about large donations and government grants. In his former life, he'd been skilled at manipulating numbers, at making papers show whatever reality his clients had wanted to see. "No," he whispered, trying to silence the destructive thoughts. But desperation has a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. With trembling hands, he reached for his laptop. The screen illuminated his face as he began researching the shelter's public records, his financial expertise guiding him through tax documents and annual reports. He could create a story, craft evidence that would cast doubt on David's management of funds. The threat of exposure might be enough to secure what he needed: money for his habit, a way out of this nightmare. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He was planning to betray the very person who had once saved his life. But addiction's grip was stronger than gratitude, its needs more pressing than morality. Over the next few days, James meticulously built his case. He fabricated documents, twisted numbers, and constructed a narrative that would cast a shadow over David's integrity. His hands shook less when he was focused on this task, the familiar world of spreadsheets and financial statements providing a temporary escape from his cravings. "It's not personal," he told himself as he prepared to file the complaints. "I just need enough to get back on my feet." But in the quiet hours of the night, when withdrawal kept him pacing his small apartment, James caught glimpses of his former self in the mirror, the man who had stood proud at Hope Harbor, helping others find their way back to light. That man seemed like a stranger now, a ghost of possibilities lost. The faces of those he'd helped haunted his dreams: the single mother who'd learned to budget for her children's future, the elderly man who'd finally understood how to protect his social security from scammers, the young couple who'd rebuilt their credit score and bought their first home. All of them had trusted him, just as David had trusted him. Yet the darkness of addiction proved stronger than memory. One morning, James dressed in his last clean suit, a relic from his banking days, and headed to the courthouse. Each step felt like a betrayal, but the burning need for his next fix drove him forward. He'd convinced himself that David would understand, that somehow this would work out for everyone. As he approached the courthouse steps, James caught his reflection in the building's glass doors. For a moment, he saw himself as others would see him, not the successful mentor from Hope Harbor, not the rising financial star he'd once been, but a hollow shell of a man about to destroy the person who had offered him salvation. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force, but addiction's voice was louder than conscience, its demands more urgent than truth. James straightened his tie, clutched his folder of fabricated evidence, and pushed through the door, stepping into the shadow of his darkest decision yet. Behind him, the morning sun continued to rise over Pine Grove, its light touching the cross atop Hope Harbor shelter in the distance. In a few hours, David would arrive there, unaware that the foundation of everything he'd built was about to be tested by the very person he had once helped save. Dawn had barely broken over Pine Grove when the first police cruiser pulled up to Hope Harbor shelter. The red and blue lights cast eerie shadows through the morning mist, drawing curious glances from early risers making their way to the dining hall. David Thompson stood at his office window, watching as two officers emerged from the vehicle, their expressions grave and purposeful. He had been reviewing the morning's devotional message when Martha burst into his office, her face pale. "David, there are police outside, and there's a news van pulling up too." Before he could respond, a firm knock echoed through the room. Detective Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway, her badge glinting in the early light. Behind her, Officer Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. David recognized him from the shelter's Thanksgiving dinner last year. "Pastor Thompson," Detective Morrison began, her voice professional but tinged with regret. "We need to speak with you regarding some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention." David gestured for them to sit, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Of course, Detective. What seems to be the problem?" "We've received detailed documentation suggesting financial irregularities in the shelter's operations." She placed a thick folder on his desk. "The allegations include misappropriation of funds, fraudulent reporting, and exploitation of shelter residents. The words hit David like physical blows. That's impossible. Every dollar that comes through Hope Harbor is meticulously accounted for. We have regular audits, oversight committees. The complainant has provided extensive evidence. Detective Morrison continued, opening the folder. Bank statements, transfer records, apparently altered documentation spanning the past 3 years. David's eyes scanned the papers before him, his confusion growing with each page. The documents looked official, bearing all the right letterheads and signatures, but the numbers were wrong. Everything was wrong. "These aren't our real records," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Someone has fabricated these." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, David could see more news vans arriving, reporters setting up cameras on the shelter's lawn. His heart sank as he recognized James Riley standing among them, speaking into a microphone. "James?" The name escaped his lips in a whisper of disbelief. The sight of his former student, the man he had mentored and believed in, standing there as the architect of these accusations, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. On the security monitor mounted on his wall, David could see the scene unfolding outside. James's voice came through clearly. "I work closely with Pastor Thompson, handling some of the shelter's financial education programs. What I discovered was a systematic abuse of trust, a manipulation of funds meant to help the homeless." Martha appeared in the doorway again, tears streaming down her face. "David, the residents are watching the news. Everyone's confused and frightened. What should we tell them?" Before he could answer, his phone began buzzing with incoming calls. The screen showed names of board members, donors, and local church leaders, all presumably seeking explanations for the accusations being broadcast across local news. Detective Morrison cleared her throat. "Pastor Thompson, given the nature of these allegations and the evidence presented, will need to conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime," she paused, genuine regret crossing her features, "the department has been instructed to temporarily close the shelter pending the investigation." "Close the shelter?" David stood abruptly. "Detective, we have over 70 people currently in residence. Where will they go?" "The city has arranged temporary accommodation at the community center," Officer Jenkins spoke up, unable to meet David's eyes. "We'll help with the transition." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. David watched helplessly as residents packed their belongings, many crying or expressing confusion and anger. The staff worked tirelessly to ensure everyone had transportation to the community center, while reporters continued to gather outside, their cameras capturing every moment of the shelter's unraveling. Jerome, the maintenance man who had been so proud of his upcoming job opportunity, approached David with slumped shoulders. "Pastor, I don't understand. You've given everything to this place, to all of us. How can they believe these lies?" David placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder, fighting to keep his own emotions in check. "Sometimes, Jerome, the darkest times reveal the greatest truths. Keep focusing on your training. Don't let this setback derail your progress." As the day wore on, more damaging revelations emerged. James had apparently spent weeks building his case, gathering sympathetic testimony from former residents who had left the program unsuccessfully. Each new accusation seemed designed to cast doubt, not just on the shelter's financial dealings, but on David's character itself. The local news ran interviews with supposed witnesses claiming they had seen David living an extravagant lifestyle, fancy cars, expensive suits, lavish vacations. The truth, that he lived in a modest apartment above the church and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, seemed lost in the sensational narrative being crafted. By evening, the shelter stood empty, its halls silent for the first time in 15 years. David sat alone in his office, surrounded by the photographs of countless lives transformed within these walls. Each face told a story of hope and redemption, yet now those very stories were being twisted into something unrecognizable. His phone rang again. This time it was Pastor Marcus. "David, the church board is meeting tonight to discuss the situation. I'm trying to advocate for you, but these allegations are serious. The evidence looks convincing." "Marcus, you know me. You've seen the work we do here. How can you doubt?" "I don't want to doubt, David, but James has provided documentation that appears legitimate. The board has a responsibility to the congregation, to the community." After hanging up, David walked through the empty shelter, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. In the dining hall, abandoned coffee cups still sat on tables where residents had been having breakfast when the police arrived. The daily schedule board still showed tomorrow's activities, job training sessions that would never happen, counseling appointments now cancelled, lives left in limbo. Standing in the middle of the room, David remembered James's first day at the shelter. He had been so broken then, yet so determined to change. What had gone wrong? How had he missed the signs that James was struggling? The weight of those questions pressed down on him, mixing with the larger uncertainty of how to fight accusations that seemed designed to be unfightable. As night fell over Pine Grove, David knelt in the shelter's small chapel. The stained glass windows that usually glowed with warm light now stood dark and silent. In the distance, he could hear the continued murmur of news crews setting up for their evening broadcasts, preparing to share this story of alleged corruption with an even wider audience. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I don't understand. All these years I've tried to serve faithfully, to help those in need, to be a light in the darkness. Why this? Why now?" Only silence answered, but as David rose to his feet, a strange calm settled over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more questions, more accusations, but tonight, in the quiet of the chapel, he held on to one certainty: the truth would eventually come to light. What he didn't know was that this crisis would test not just his faith, but the very foundations of everything he believed about redemption, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways in which divine purpose sometimes works through human pain. The first week after Hope Harbor's closure felt like the longest of David Thompson's life. Each morning, he woke to the same crushing reality. The shelter remained shuttered, its residents scattered, and his life's work hanging by a thread. The local news continued their coverage, each day bringing new revelations and accusations that seemed designed to erode what little faith the community still had in him. Standing in his small apartment above the church, David watched the sunrise paint the town in shades of gold. The sight that had once filled him with hope now served as a bitter reminder of all he had lost. From his window, he could see the shelter's building, its dark windows and empty parking lot, a stark contrast to the bustling sanctuary it had been just days ago. His phone lay silent on the kitchen counter. The constant barrage of calls from reporters had finally ceased, replaced by an equally painful silence from those he had considered friends. The few messages he did receive were from his lawyer, updating him on the mounting legal challenges ahead. A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. Martha stood in the hallway, her usual confident demeanor replaced by worried determination. She carried a covered dish, steam rising from beneath the foil. "You need to eat," she said firmly, pushing past him into the apartment. "And don't tell me you're not hungry. I've known you too long to believe that." David managed a weak smile. Martha had been one of the few to stand by him, despite the pressure from her own family to distance herself from the scandal. "You don't have to do this, Martha." "Nonsense," she replied, setting the dish on his small dining table. "Now sit down and tell me how our people are doing at the community center." The mention of the shelter's residents sent a fresh wave of pain through David's chest. He had tried visiting them at the temporary facility, only to be turned away by city officials citing the ongoing investigation. The helplessness he felt at being unable to support those who depended on him was almost unbearable. "Jerome called yesterday," David said, picking at the food Martha had brought. "He lost his job opportunity at the hardware store. They said they couldn't risk the association given the circumstances." Martha's face darkened. "After everything that boy has overcome. It's not right, David. None of this is right." As they talked, David's eyes drifted to the wall where he had hung photographs of Hope Harbor's biggest moments: graduation ceremonies, holiday celebrations, reunited families. Each image told a story of transformation, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of despair. Now those very stories were being used against him, twisted into evidence of exploitation and manipulation. The television in the corner, which he hadn't been able to bring himself to turn off, suddenly showed James Riley's face. He looked better than he had during his last days at the shelter, cleaned up, wearing a suit that must have been new. The caption below read, "Whistleblower reveals deeper corruption at local homeless shelter." "Turn that garbage off," Martha said, reaching for the remote, but David stopped her. "I need to know what they're saying," he replied softly. "I need to understand how it came to this." On screen, James spoke with practiced sincerity about discovering financial irregularities during his time at the shelter. He described elaborate schemes of fund misappropriation, painting a picture of systematic exploitation that bore no resemblance to the truth David had lived every day for 15 years. The hardest part, James was saying, was seeing how these vulnerable people were being used. Their stories of recovery were marketed to donors, while the money meant for their care was being diverted elsewhere. David closed his eyes, remembering the real stories. The countless nights spent helping residents through withdrawal, the celebrations of small victories, the tears of joy when families were reunited. How could James forget all of that? What had driven him to construct such elaborate lies? The sound of breaking glass startled them both. David looked down to find he had gripped his water glass too tightly, sending cracks, spider-webbing across its surface. A single drop of blood welled up where the glass had cut his palm. Martha quickly grabbed a towel, her movements efficient as she cleaned up the mess. "You're not alone in this, David," she said firmly. "God hasn't abandoned you, and neither have all of us who know the truth." But the truth seemed increasingly fragile in the face of James's carefully constructed allegations. The investigation had frozen not only the shelter's accounts but also David's personal finances. His reputation, built over decades of service, was being dismantled piece by piece in the court of public opinion. Later that afternoon, David walked through the empty streets of Pine Grove, feeling the weight of stares and whispered conversations that followed him. Places that had once welcomed him now seemed to close ranks as he approached. He passed the diner where many of the shelter's residents had found their first jobs, only to see the owner quickly turn the open sign to closed. Near the town square, he encountered Sarah, one of the young mothers from the shelter. She was pushing her shopping cart, her 2 children trailing behind her. When she saw David, her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly hurried past, pulling her children close as if to protect them from some unseen danger. The rejection stung more than any accusation in the press. These were people he had helped, lives he had touched directly. Yet fear and doubt had poisoned even these relationships, leaving him increasingly isolated in a community he had served faithfully for so long. Returning to his apartment, David found several messages waiting. The first was from his lawyer, warning him about speaking to any former residents to avoid allegations of witness tampering. The second was from Pastor Marcus, informing him that the church board had voted to temporarily suspend his position pending the investigation's outcome. The final message was from an unknown number. When David played it, James's voice filled the room. "Pastor, I need..." The message cut off abruptly, leaving David staring at the phone, his heart racing with a mixture of anger and concern. That night, unable to sleep, David sat in his darkened living room, poring over shelter documents and financial records. Somewhere in these papers was the truth that could disprove James's allegations, but with each passing day, that truth seemed to slip further from his grasp. A storm was brewing outside, thunder rolling across the Texas sky. David watched lightning illuminate the shelter's building in brief, brilliant flashes. In those moments of clarity, he could almost believe this was all a terrible dream, that tomorrow he would wake to find Hope Harbor still thriving, its residents safe and supported, its mission intact. But as the storm raged on, David faced the harsh reality of his situation. The shelter remained closed, its residents scattered, and his life's work hung in the balance. Yet even in this darkness, something within him refused to break. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps simple stubbornness, but he knew he couldn't give up, not on the shelter, not on his mission, and not even on James. As rain lashed against his windows, David knelt beside his bed just as he had done every night since this ordeal began. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "give me strength to face whatever comes, and please, watch over our people, wherever they are tonight." The storm continued its assault on Pine Grove, but in his heart, David held on to a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring another chance to fight for the truth, and for all those who depended on it. The evening before the final hearing, David Thompson sat alone in his church office, surrounded by the gathering darkness. Rain pelted against the stained glass windows, distorting the last remnants of daylight into kaleidoscopic shadows. After weeks of legal battles, mounting evidence, and crumbling support, tomorrow would determine not just his fate, but the future of Hope Harbor Shelter. His desk was cluttered with papers, legal documents, newspaper clippings, and letters from former supporters expressing their disappointment. Each piece of paper represented another crack in the foundation of the life he had built. The latest article from the Pine Grove Gazette lay on top, its headline stark and damning. "Shelter Director Faces Final Judgment. Years of Alleged Exploitation Come to Light." David picked up a framed photograph, one of the few remaining pieces of Hope Harbor that he still had. It showed the shelter's first graduation ceremony. 12 people standing proud in their caps and gowns, their faces beaming with hope and accomplishment. Among them stood James Riley, his arm around David's shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera. The memory felt like a knife twisting in his heart. "Why, James?" he whispered to the empty room. "What happened to make you do this?" Thunder rolled across the sky, as if heaven itself was responding to his question. David set the photograph down and walked to the window, watching lightning illuminate the town he had served for so long. From his vantage point, he could see the shelter in the distance, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of all that had been lost. The past weeks had stripped away everything he thought he knew about his calling. The community that had once embraced him now crossed the street to avoid him. Former residents who had shared their stories of transformation now testified about alleged exploitation. Even his own church board had distanced themselves, their silence speaking volumes about their lost faith in his integrity. David's footsteps echoed through the empty church as he made his way to the sanctuary. The space that had once been filled with worship and praise now felt cavernous and cold. He stopped at the altar, where he had led countless prayers and witnessed numerous lives being transformed. "Father," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I've tried to understand. I've tried to hold on to faith through all of this, but..." His voice cracked. "Where are you in all of this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Years of steadfast faith and unwavering trust suddenly felt hollow in the face of such profound injustice. Every sermon he had preached about holding on to hope, every lesson about trusting in God's plan, now seemed to mock him. Anger and emotion he had been suppressing for weeks finally broke through. "I did everything you asked of me." His voice rose, echoing off the walls. "I gave my life to serving others. I believed in your promises. I trusted in your guidance." Lightning flashed outside, casting his shadow against the far wall. "Where were you when they closed the shelter? When our people were scattered? When everything we built was torn apart by lies?" Each question came out louder than the last, years of unspoken doubt and pain pouring out like a flood. David's fists clenched at his sides. "Do you know how many lives depend on Hope Harbor? How many people will be lost without it?" His voice broke again. "Jerome lost his job opportunity. Sarah and her children are back in the system. Thomas had to stop his medication because he can't afford it without our support." He began pacing the length of the altar, his footsteps heavy with frustration. "I've watched them take everything, piece by piece. The shelter, our reputation, our ability to help others, all of it stripped away based on lies. And through it all, I kept waiting for you to intervene, to show your power, to reveal the truth." Thunder crashed overhead and David spun to face the cross hanging above the altar. "You say you're a God of justice, but where is justice now? You claim to protect your servants, but where is your protection? Where are you when your people suffer?" His voice echoed through the empty sanctuary, each repetition of his questions seeming to mock him with their lack of answers. David fell to his knees, exhaustion and despair finally overwhelming him. "I've lost everything," he whispered, tears finally breaking free. "The shelter, the community's trust, my life's work, all of it gone. And tomorrow..." He couldn't finish the thought. Tomorrow's hearing loomed before him like an approaching storm, threatening to destroy whatever fragments of his ministry remained. As if in response to his despair, the storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury, and wind howled through the eaves of the old church. David remained on his knees, his body shaking with sobs he had held back for too long. Minutes stretched into hours as he knelt there, pouring out years of accumulated pain, doubt, and fear. The careful walls of faith and certainty he had built around himself crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable before the God he had served so faithfully. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "I've tried to be faithful. I've tried to serve. I've tried to show your love to others. Was it all for nothing?" The storm continued its assault on the church, but inside, a different kind of storm was raging. Every certainty David had built his life upon seemed to be crumbling. The simple faith that had sustained him through years of ministry felt inadequate in the face of such profound injustice. As midnight approached, David finally rose from his knees, his legs stiff from hours of prayer. He walked unsteadily to his office, gathering the papers he would need for tomorrow's hearing. Each document seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, laden with the accusations and lies that had destroyed his life's work. Before leaving, he paused at his desk one last time, looking at the photograph of James and the other graduates. Despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to hate the man who had betrayed him. Somewhere beneath the lies and manipulation was the person he had known, the man who had fought so hard to overcome his addiction, who had helped others find their way back to hope. "Lord," David whispered one final time. "If you're still listening, I don't understand your plan. I don't see your purpose in this. But tomorrow," he took a deep breath, "tomorrow, I place myself in your hands. Whatever happens, let your will be done." As he locked up the church and stepped into the storm, David felt oddly calm. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps something had shifted during his hours of desperate prayer. Either way, he knew that tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. His part now was simply to face it with whatever grace he could muster. The rain soaked him as he walked to his car, but he hardly noticed. His mind was already on tomorrow's hearing, on the faces he would have to confront, on the accusations he would have to answer. Yet beneath the weight of it all, something had changed. He had poured out his anger and doubt before God, and though no obvious answer had come, the very act of honest wrestling with his faith had left him strangely strengthened. What David couldn't know as he drove home through the storm was that his darkest night would soon give way to an unexpected dawn. The very next day would bring a twist that no one could have anticipated, a moment of divine intervention that would transform his story of injustice into a testimony of grace. The same storm that witnessed David Thompson's crisis of faith raged outside James Riley's motel room on the outskirts of Pine Grove. He paced the cramped space, his hands shaking as he tried to ignore the growing need for another fix. The hearing tomorrow would be the culmination of his carefully constructed lies, but something felt different tonight. The certainty that had driven him for weeks was crumbling. Empty pill bottles littered the bedside table, and crumpled papers covered the floor, drafts of his testimony, carefully crafted to destroy the man who had once saved his life. The local news played silently on the television, showing yet another report about the shelter scandal. James caught his own image on the screen and quickly looked away, unable to bear the sight of what he had become. "Just get through tomorrow," he muttered to himself, running trembling fingers through his disheveled hair. "One more day, and it'll all be over." But as he sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally overwhelming him, something strange began to happen. The room seemed to shift and blur, and suddenly he wasn't in the motel anymore. He found himself standing in Hope Harbor's dining hall, but not as it was now, as it had been on his first morning there, 2 years ago. The scene unfolded before him with startling clarity. He watched himself shuffling through the breakfast line, hollow-eyed and desperate, while David Thompson approached with a gentle smile and a cup of coffee. "Sometimes the first step is just accepting help," David had said, his voice as clear now as it had been that day. Before James could process what was happening, the scene changed. Now he was in the shelter's classroom, teaching other residents about financial literacy. He saw the pride in their eyes as they grasped new concepts, the hope that bloomed as they realized they could rebuild their lives. Clara, a single mother of 3, crying with joy when she finally understood how to create a budget that would work for her family. "No," James whispered, trying to shake off these visions. "This isn't real." But the memories continued to flood his consciousness. He saw Thomas, the veteran who had lost everything to PTSD, learning to paint in art therapy. Sarah, who had fled an abusive relationship, celebrating her first job interview. Jerome beaming with pride as he mastered new maintenance skills. Each face, each story, each moment of transformation played out before him with impossible clarity. He saw the late-night counseling sessions when David would sit with residents through their darkest moments, the celebration dinners when someone reached a milestone in their recovery, the quiet acts of kindness that never made it into any report or documentation. The scenes shifted faster now, showing him hundreds of lives touched by Hope Harbor. A teenage runaway reuniting with her parents, an elderly man finding purpose again through volunteering, a young couple getting married in the shelter's chapel, their lives rebuilt from the ashes of addiction. "Stop!" James cried out, but the visions kept coming. He saw himself during his own recovery, working through the program, finding strength he didn't know he had. David had been there every step of the way, offering guidance without judgment, support without condition. The memory of his graduation ceremony struck him like a physical blow. The pride in David's eyes as he handed James his certificate, the genuine joy in his embrace. Lightning flashed outside, and for a moment, James saw his reflection in the motel room window. The man looking back at him was unrecognizable, not the successful mentor he had been at Hope Harbor, not even the desperate addict who had first arrived there, but something worse, a betrayer. The weight of what he had done, what he was about to do, crashed over him. Every fabricated document, every twisted truth, every manipulated statement stood in stark contrast to the reality he had just witnessed. He had taken the story of hope and transformation, that was Hope Harbor's true legacy and corrupted it into something ugly and false. More memories flooded his mind. David staying late to help him study for his financial certification exam, the Christmas Eve when the shelter's heating failed and David worked through the night to get it fixed, refusing to let anyone go cold. The countless small moments of compassion and dedication that had nothing to do with money or recognition. God, James whispered, falling to his knees beside the bed. What have I done? Thunder rolled overhead as the full impact of his actions hit him. He had not just betrayed David, he had betrayed every person who had ever found hope within those shelter walls. His lies threatened not just one man's reputation, but the very existence of a place that had saved countless lives, including his own. Through tears, James looked at the papers scattered across the floor, his testimony for tomorrow's hearing, the fabricated evidence, the carefully constructed web of lies. Each page seemed to accuse him now, weighted with the consequences of his actions. He thought of the current residents, displaced when the shelter was closed. How many of them had returned to the streets? How many had relapsed without the support they desperately needed? The faces from his visions haunted him: Clara's children, Thomas's paintings, Sarah's hard-won confidence, all of it jeopardized by his desperation and addiction. Standing on shaky legs, James walked to the window. The storm continued to rage, but something had changed inside him. The compulsion that had driven him to destroy Hope Harbor was being replaced by an overwhelming need to make things right. He picked up his phone, starting to dial David's number, but stopped. Words spoken over the phone wouldn't be enough. This kind of betrayal demanded more than a simple apology. Tomorrow's hearing, the very event he had engineered to complete David's destruction, would instead become his opportunity for confession and truth. As this resolution formed in his mind, James felt a peculiar calm settle over him. The physical craving that had been his constant companion seemed to recede, replaced by a clarity he hadn't experienced in months. He knew what he had to do. Moving with purpose now, he gathered all the falsified documents and evidence he had created. Each page represented a choice he could now unmake. He would go to the courthouse early, before the hearing began. He would confess everything to the prosecutor, reveal every lie, expose every manipulation. The cost would be high. He would likely face charges for his deception, lose what little credibility he had left, possibly even serve time. But as he thought of all the lives that depended on Hope Harbor, of David's unwavering dedication to serving others, he knew it was a price he had to pay. James spent the rest of the night writing out his confession, documenting every detail of how he had constructed his false narrative. As he wrote, more memories surfaced, not as overwhelming visions now, but as gentle reminders of the truth he had tried to bury beneath his lies. When dawn finally broke over Pine Grove, the storm had passed. James stood in his motel room, clutching the folder containing his confession, and watched the sun rise. In a few hours, he would walk into the courthouse and tear down the web of lies he had spent weeks weaving. The thought terrified him, but beneath the fear was something else, something that felt surprisingly like hope. What he couldn't know was that his decision, born from a night of divine intervention, would not only save Hope Harbor, but would become part of a larger story of redemption that would touch far more lives than he could imagine. Dawn broke over the Pine Grove courthouse, its marble steps still wet from the night storm. David Thompson stood at the bottom of those steps, his weathered Bible clutched in one hand, watching the early morning light paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. After weeks of accusations and mounting evidence, this day would determine not just his fate, but the future of Hope Harbor Shelter. He had arrived early, seeking a moment of quiet before facing what lay ahead. The media had already begun to gather, setting up their cameras and microphones, eager to capture what they believed would be the final chapter in a scandal that had captivated the small Texas town. David could hear their whispered conversations, see their sideways glances. "Pastor Thompson," a reporter rushed forward, microphone extended. "Any comment on today's hearing? How do you respond to the mounting evidence against you?" Before David could answer, a familiar voice cut through the morning air. "David." It was Martha, making her way through the crowd with determination. She reached his side, linking her arm through his. "You don't have to talk to them," she said firmly, guiding him toward the courthouse doors. But something made David pause. Through the growing crowd, he caught sight of a figure approaching from the direction of the Pine Grove Motel. Even at a distance, he recognized James Riley's gait, though something about it seemed different today, more urgent, less assured. James was carrying a thick folder, his suit rumpled as if he'd slept in it. As he drew closer, David could see that his former student's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be a sleepless night. The reporters, sensing a story, swung their cameras toward him. "Mr. Riley, are you ready to present your evidence against Pastor Thompson?" James ignored them, his eyes fixed on David. The two men stood facing each other at the bottom of the courthouse steps, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them. The crowd fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "Pastor David," James began, his voice trembling. Before he could continue, the courthouse doors opened and District Attorney Sarah Mitchell emerged. "We're ready to begin," she announced. "Mr. Riley, we'll need to review your final documentation before the hearing." James straightened his shoulders, clutching his folder tighter. "Actually," he said, his voice growing stronger, "there's something I need to say first. To all of you." The reporters pressed closer, cameras rolling. David felt Martha's hand tighten on his arm as James stepped forward, facing the crowd. "Everything I've said about Pastor Thompson and Hope Harbor Shelter has been a lie," James declared, his words cutting through the morning air like thunder. "Every document I presented was falsified. Every accusation was fabricated. His voice broke. "I betrayed the man and the place that saved my life." A collective gasp went up from the assembled crowd. The district attorney stepped forward, her expression stern. "Mr. Riley, are you aware of the seriousness of what you're saying?" "Yes," James replied, opening his folder. "I've spent the night documenting everything. How I created the false evidence, how I manipulated records, how I let my addiction drive me to destroy something beautiful and good." He turned to David, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Pastor. What I did, there's no excuse." David stood frozen, waves of emotion washing over him. The past weeks of pain and uncertainty, the nights of questioning God's plan, the weight of betrayal, all of it seemed to crystallize in this moment. "Last night," James continued, his voice growing stronger, "I was shown the truth. Every life that Hope Harbor has touched, every person who found healing there, every moment of grace and transformation, it all came back to me. I couldn't go through with this lie anymore." The district attorney was examining the contents of James's folder, her expression growing increasingly grave. "These confessions are quite detailed, Mr. Riley. You understand this could result in serious charges against you." "I understand," James nodded, "and I'll accept whatever consequences come. But I had to tell the truth. Hope Harbor is too important to too many people. Pastor David is too important." Reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing, but David heard none of it. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and James. The younger man flinched as if expecting condemnation, but David simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "James," he said softly, "what happened? Why didn't you come to me when you were struggling?" James's composure broke completely. "I was ashamed," he sobbed. "After everything you'd done for me, after all the trust you placed in me, I couldn't face you when I relapsed. The addiction, it twisted everything, made me desperate. But last night," he looked up, his eyes clear despite his tears. "Last night, God showed me what I was really destroying." The district attorney cleared her throat. "Given these developments, we'll need to postpone today's hearing. Mr. Riley, you'll need to come with us to make a formal statement. And Pastor Thompson," she turned to David, her expression softening, "I believe we owe you an apology." But David's attention remained on James. "The charges against me aren't what matters now," he said. "What matters is that you've chosen truth over lies, healing over destruction. That's what Hope Harbor has always been about. Second chances, redemption, hope." Martha stepped forward, her voice firm but gentle. "The shelter's residents, they need to hear this. They need to know they can come home." David nodded, then turned to the district attorney. "Before you take James's statement, may I have a moment with him? There's something I need to say." In a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, away from the cameras and chaos, David faced the man who had nearly destroyed everything he had built. But instead of anger, he felt a profound sense of God's presence in this moment. "James," he began, "what you did caused a lot of pain. People who depended on Hope Harbor have suffered because of your actions." He paused, watching James's shoulders slump under the weight of truth. "But I forgive you. And more than that, when you're ready, after you've dealt with the legal consequences of all this, there's a place for you at Hope Harbor." James looked up, disbelief written across his face. How can you even consider trusting me again?" "Because that's what Hope Harbor is about," David replied. "It's about believing that no one is beyond redemption, that every story can have a new chapter." Your confession today proves that truth is stronger than lies, that God's grace is more powerful than our mistakes. Outside, they could hear the media frenzy growing as news of James's confession spread through Pine Grove. Soon, there would be questions to answer, systems to rebuild, trust to restore. But in this moment, David saw something he had almost lost faith in during his darkest hours, God's hand moving in ways he couldn't have imagined. As James was led away by law enforcement officials, David stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows. Martha appeared at his side, tears in her eyes. "Well," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it looks like we have some work to do. Those biscuits aren't going to bake themselves, and our people need to come home." David smiled, feeling the weight of weeks of uncertainty finally lifting. "Yes," he replied, "they do need to come home, all of them." What had begun as a day of judgment had transformed into a testimony of God's faithfulness. As David walked down the courthouse steps, reporters clamoring for his statement, he knew that this was more than just vindication. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the very principles Hope Harbor had always stood for: grace, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. The sun had fully risen over Pine Grove now, its light touching everything with the promise of a new day. And in that light, David could see the next chapter of Hope Harbor's story beginning to unfold. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across David Thompson's office as he sat at his desk, surrounded by the aftermath of James's confession. News crews had finally dispersed from the courthouse steps, but their vans still dotted the streets of Pine Grove, hungry for the next development in a story that had taken an unexpected turn. The headlines had already begun to shift. Shelter director vindicated. Accuser confesses to elaborate hoax. Hope Harbor story takes miraculous turn. David looked down at the letter in his hands, a formal apology from the district attorney's office, accompanied by documents that would allow Hope Harbor to reopen its doors. But his mind wasn't on the paperwork. Instead, he was thinking about James, who now sat in the county jail awaiting his arraignment. Martha burst into the office, her arms full of papers. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," she announced, setting down her load. "Former residents wanting to know when they can return, volunteers asking when we'll reopen, donors pledging their support again." She paused, studying David's expression. "But that's not what's troubling you, is it?" "I've been thinking about James," David replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "About what happens next." "David Thompson," Martha said, placing her hands on her hips. "I know that look. You're planning something." He nodded, pulling out a legal pad covered in notes. "James needs help, Martha. Real help this time. Not just with his addiction, but with healing from whatever drove him to such desperation. And I believe Hope Harbor needs to be part of that healing." "Are you sure?" Martha's voice was gentle but concerned. After everything he did, David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the shelter building across the street. Workers were already removing the official closure notices from the doors. "Do you remember what I said at the very first shelter meeting 15 years ago? That everyone deserves a second chance," Martha quoted from memory. "That grace isn't just about forgiveness, it's about restoration." "Exactly." David turned back to face her. "If we can't extend that same grace to James, then everything we've preached about redemption becomes just empty words." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. David met with his lawyer to discuss the legal implications of his plan. Then came conversations with the shelter's board members, many of whom were skeptical about welcoming James back after his release. But David remained firm in his conviction. Late that evening, he made his way to the county jail. The guard led him to a small meeting room where James sat, still wearing the same rumpled suit from the courthouse. The younger man's face showed signs of withdrawal, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in months. "Pastor David," James began, his voice rough with emotion, "you shouldn't be here. After what I did." "That's exactly why I should be here," David interrupted gently, taking a seat across from him. "James, I want you to understand something. What you did caused real harm. People suffered when the shelter closed. Trust was broken. Lives were disrupted." James hung his head, shame evident in every line of his body. "But," David continued, "that's not the end of the story. Not if we don't let it be." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. "This is a plan for your rehabilitation, not just from addiction, but a complete restoration program. When you're released, assuming the judge agrees, you'll enter an intensive recovery program at Hope Harbor." James looked up, disbelief written across his face. "You can't be serious. Nobody would trust me there again." Maybe not at first, David acknowledged. Trust has to be rebuilt just like everything else in recovery. But here's what I believe, James. Your story of redemption could help others find their way back from the edge. Your confession today showed tremendous courage. That same courage can help you make things right. Tears began streaming down James's face. Why? He whispered. Why would you do this for me? Because 15 years ago, I made a promise to God that Hope Harbor would be a place of second chances. That includes you, James. Especially you. Over the next hour, they talked through the details of the program. It would be rigorous. Intensive counseling, addiction recovery meetings, community service, and a gradual process of making amends to those who had been hurt by his actions. James would need to earn back every ounce of trust he had broken. As David left the jail that night, he found Martha waiting in the parking lot. Well? She asked. He agreed, David replied. It won't be easy, but he's willing to try. You know not everyone will understand this decision, Martha warned as they walked to their cars. Some might see it as naive, even foolish. David nodded, remembering his own dark night of questioning God's plan. Sometimes the most powerful testimony of faith is doing what seems foolish to the world. James's attempt to destroy Hope Harbor failed because God had a bigger plan, not just for the shelter but for James himself. The next few days were a blur of activity as they prepared to reopen the shelter. David worked tirelessly, meeting with residents who would be returning, coordinating with staff and volunteers, and helping to restore the programs that had been interrupted. But through it all, he kept thinking about James's transformation. One morning, as he stood in the shelter's chapel preparing for the reopening ceremony, David heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Jerome, one of the residents who had lost his job opportunity during the closure. I heard about your plan for James, Jerome said, his voice carefully neutral. Got to admit, Pastor, I struggled with it at first. Man nearly destroyed everything we built here. David waited, sensing there was more. But then I remembered my first day here, Jerome continued. How you saw past my mistakes, gave me a chance when nobody else would, made me realize that's what this place is really about, isn't it? Not just helping the easy cases, but believing in redemption even when it seems impossible. David placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder. That's exactly what it's about. And James's recovery won't just be his journey. It'll be a testimony to everything Hope Harbor stands for. As the sun set that evening, David stood in the shelter's dining hall, where volunteers were preparing for the next day's reopening. The tables were set, the kitchen was stocked, and hope hung in the air like a tangible presence. Tomorrow, Hope Harbor would welcome its residents home, beginning a new chapter in its story, but it wouldn't just be a return to what was before. Through this trial, something new had been forged, a deeper understanding of grace, a stronger testament to the power of forgiveness, and a living example of how God could turn even the darkest situations into opportunities for redemption. David looked up at the cross hanging on the dining hall wall, remembering his night of desperate prayer in the church. The answer had come, not in the way he had expected, but in a demonstration of God's power to transform lives. Not just James's life, but all of their lives, through the revolutionary act of forgiveness. As he switched off the lights and prepared to leave, David paused in the doorway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight in the quiet of this sacred space, he felt the presence of divine purpose. Hope Harbor's mission had never been clearer, to be a place where grace triumphs over judgment, where redemption overcomes despair, and where forgiveness opens the door to miraculous transformation. The morning of Hope Harbor's reopening dawned clear and bright, the kind of Texas morning that seemed to promise new beginnings. David Thompson stood at the shelter's entrance, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the newly polished sign above the door. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity, cleaning, restocking, reorganizing, but now finally they were ready to welcome their family home. Martha had arrived before dawn, the scent of fresh coffee and baking biscuits already filling the air. Through the windows, David could see volunteers setting up the dining hall, their movements filled with purpose and joy. The long tables gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each place set with care, waiting for the return of those who had been scattered by the crisis. Pastor David? A familiar voice drew his attention. Sarah stood at the bottom of the steps, her two children clutching her hands. Behind her, other former residents were beginning to gather, faces he had missed during the long weeks of separation. Some looked uncertain, others eager, all carrying the weight of their interrupted journeys. "Welcome home," David said, his voice thick with emotion as he opened the doors wide. The words seemed to break a spell, and people began moving forward, climbing the steps with a mixture of hesitation and hope. Jerome was among them, his toolbox in hand. "Maintenance man reporting for duty," he announced with a grin that couldn't quite hide his own tears. "Place probably fell apart without me." Inside, the reunion unfolded like a scene from a homecoming. Martha emerged from the kitchen, wielding her wooden spoon like a conductor's baton, as she directed volunteers carrying trays of breakfast. The dining hall filled with the sound of greetings, laughter, and quiet tears of relief. Thomas, the veteran who had found healing through art therapy, immediately went to check on his paintings in the recreation room. "They're all still here," he called out, his voice wavering. "Every single one." David moved through the crowd, greeting each person by name, listening to stories of their time away. Some had found temporary shelter with family or friends. Others had struggled in the city's overcrowded system. All spoke of missing the sense of community they had found at Hope Harbor. "Pastor," Clara approached him, her voice low. "We heard about James, about what really happened, and about your plan to help him." She hesitated. "Some of us have been talking about it." David braced himself, expecting resistance to the idea of welcoming back the man who had caused so much pain. But Clara surprised him. "We want to help," she said firmly. "When James comes back for rehabilitation, we want to be part of his recovery team. Who better to help him understand the impact of his actions than the people who lived through them?" The offer touched David deeply, reinforcing his belief in the transformative power of community. "That's exactly what Hope Harbor is about," he replied. "Healing happens best when we walk alongside each other." As the morning progressed, more people arrived, volunteers returning to their posts, local church members bringing donations. Even some of the reporters who had covered the scandal now came to document the restoration. The shelter hummed with activity, each room coming back to life as programs resumed and services restarted. In his office, David found a stack of letters from supporters across the country. The story of Hope Harbor's vindication and his choice to forgive James had spread beyond Pine Grove, touching hearts and challenging assumptions about redemption and second chances. A knock at his door revealed Pastor Marcus looking somewhat sheepish. "David," he began, "I owe you an apology. When the accusations first came out, we all should have stood by you more firmly." David gestured for his friend to sit. "What matters is that we move forward. The shelter needs its supporters now more than ever." "And you'll have them," Marcus assured him. "The Ministerial Alliance met yesterday. We're committed to helping Hope Harbor expand its services. What you're doing with James, it's challenged us all to think deeper about what it means to live out our faith." The conversation was interrupted by sounds of commotion from the dining hall. David hurried out to find Rachel, their computer skills instructor, leading a group of residents in rearranging the learning center. They had created a new space specifically designed for addiction recovery support groups. "We thought," Rachel explained, seeing David's questioning look, "that when James returns, he'll need a proper place for meetings. And not just him. Maybe his story will encourage others who've been hiding their struggles to seek help." Throughout the day, David witnessed countless small acts of restoration. Jerome repaired things that had fallen into disrepair during the closure. Sarah's children helped replant the vegetable garden that had withered in their absence. Thomas began planning a new mural for the entrance hall, one that would tell the story of hope overcoming adversity. In the late afternoon, David received a call from his lawyer. James's arraignment had gone better than expected. The judge, moved by his voluntary confession and David's rehabilitation plan, had agreed to a program of restorative justice. Once his initial mandatory treatment was complete, James would be allowed to return to Hope Harbor under strict supervision. As David shared the news with the shelter's community, he was struck by the mix of emotions that crossed their faces: caution, compassion, determination. These were people who understood struggle, who had faced their own demons and emerged stronger. They knew the hard work of rebuilding trust because they had done it themselves. Evening found David in the shelter's chapel, surrounded by residents and staff for a special service of rededication. The small space overflowed with people, some standing along the walls, others sitting on the floor. As he looked out at their faces in the gentle light, he saw not just individuals, but a tapestry of interconnected stories. "Hope Harbor," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "has always been more than just a shelter. It's a testament to the belief that every life has value, that every story can be redeemed, that every broken piece can be made whole again." He paused, letting his gaze move across the gathering. "These past weeks have tested that belief. We've experienced betrayal, separation, and doubt. But standing here tonight, I see something remarkable. a community that refuses to let hardship have the final word. Outside, the sun was setting over Pine Grove, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Through the chapel's windows, its light seemed to touch each person with a golden glow, as if highlighting the divine presence in their midst. As we move forward, David continued, we carry with us a deeper understanding of our mission. James's story, both his fall and his coming redemption, will become part of the larger story we share. It will remind us that hope isn't just a word on our sign. It's the power that transforms lives one day, one choice, one act of forgiveness at a time. The service concluded with a song, voices joining together in a hymn that spoke of grace and restoration. As the last notes faded, David looked around at this family that had been tested and strengthened by adversity. Hope Harbor was more than restored. It was renewed, its purpose refined by the fire of trial. Night settled over the shelter, but lights burned bright in every window. Inside, life continued, dinner being served, programs running, conversations flowing. The machinery of hope was running again, its gears turning with renewed purpose, its mission clearer than ever before. David stood at his usual post near the dining hall entrance, watching as his community settled back into their home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities for transformation. But tonight, in this moment of restoration, he felt the presence of divine purpose more strongly than ever. Hope Harbor was back, not just as a shelter, but as a living testimony to the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the endless possibility of new beginnings. 6 months after Hope Harbor's reopening, James Riley stood before the shelter's weekly community meeting, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium. The dining hall was packed. Current residents, staff, volunteers, and even some local church members had gathered to hear him speak. David Thompson sat in the front row, offering an encouraging nod. "My name is James," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And I'm not just a recovering addict. I'm also the man who tried to destroy this place." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "But that's not the end of my story. Thanks to Pastor David and this community, I'm learning that no mistake is too big for grace to overcome." The journey to this moment had been arduous. After 3 months in the county's mandatory treatment program, James had returned to Hope Harbor under strict conditions. The same halls he had once walked as a mentor, he now traversed as a humble student of recovery, rebuilding trust one small act at a time. David watched James continue his testimony, remembering the day of his return. The shelter's community had gathered just as they were now, but then the atmosphere had been tense, uncertain. James had stood before them, vulnerable and ashamed as David explained the rehabilitation plan. "Each day," James continued, bringing David back to the present, "I work to make amends, not just through words, but through actions. Every morning I help Jerome with maintenance. In the afternoons I assist Martha in the kitchen. Between tasks I attend counseling sessions and recovery meetings." He gestured to Clara, who sat with her children near the front. "Clara here runs our financial literacy program now, the one I used to teach. She's doing a better job than I ever did, because she leads with compassion instead of pride. Watching her, I'm learning what true service looks like." The transformation in James over the past months had been remarkable. The haunted look that had marked his features during the scandal had been replaced by something quieter, more genuine. His designer suits were gone, replaced by simple work clothes, often bearing the marks of whatever shelter maintenance project he'd been helping with. "But the hardest part," James continued, his voice thickening with emotion, "hasn't been the physical work. It's been facing the consequences of my actions every day, looking into the eyes of people I hurt, hearing their stories of what happened when the shelter closed." David noticed several heads nodding in the audience. Many of them had shared their stories with James during the shelter's restorative justice sessions, carefully facilitated meetings where residents could express how the closure had affected them. "Thomas," James turned to the veteran artist, "told me how he relapsed when his art therapy sessions were interrupted. Sarah's children missed 2 weeks of school when their family had to stay at the emergency shelter. Jerome almost lost his chance at a new career." Tears were flowing freely now, both from James and many in the audience. "But here's the miracle," he continued. "These same people I hurt, they're the ones who've taught me the most about forgiveness. They've shown me what it means to give someone a second chance." The room fell silent as James shared how the community had gradually begun to trust him again. He spoke of small moments, Martha teaching him her biscuit recipe, Jerome showing him how to fix a leaking pipe, Thomas inviting him to try painting as a way to process his emotions. Recovery isn't just about staying clean, James explained. It's about learning to live honestly, to serve others, to accept grace when you know you don't deserve it. Every day at Hope Harbor, I see people doing the hard work of rebuilding their lives. Now I'm one of them, and their courage inspires me to keep going. David thought about how far they'd all come. The shelter was thriving now, with expanded programs and growing community support. James's story, rather than destroying Hope Harbor's reputation, had become a powerful testimony to its mission of transformation. Pastor David, James turned to face him directly, took the biggest risk of all. When everyone else would have rejected me, he offered me a chance at redemption. He showed me what it means to love your enemies, to return good for evil. From the back of the room, Pastor Marcus spoke up. James, what would you say to others who might be struggling like you were, who might be hiding their addictions, afraid to seek help? James considered the question carefully. I'd say that the shame that keeps you hiding is a liar. The voice that tells you you're too far gone to be helped is a liar. I know, because I believed those lies. They drove me to betray the people who cared about me most. He gestured around the room. But look at this place. Look at these people. Every person here has a story of overcoming something that seemed impossible. If Hope Harbor could forgive me, could help me find my way back, then there's hope for anyone. As James concluded his testimony, David rose to stand beside him at the podium. James's story, he addressed the gathering, is Hope Harbor's story. It's a reminder that God's grace can transform even our worst moments into testimonies of hope. The meeting ended with a prayer, but people lingered afterward, many approaching James to share words of encouragement or their own stories of recovery. David watched as his former accuser, now his brother in healing, listened to each person with genuine humility and care. Later that evening, as they cleaned up the dining hall, James helped David stack chairs. "Pastor," he said quietly, "do you ever regret giving me this chance?" David paused, looking at the young man who had caused him so much pain, yet whose transformation had brought so much hope to others. "James, sometimes God's greatest works come from what seems like our worst disasters. Your story is touching lives in ways my sermons never could." Outside, the sun was setting over Pine Grove, casting long shadows through the shelter's windows. In the kitchen, Martha was teaching a new resident her biscuit recipe, the same one she'd shared with James months ago. Down the hall, Thomas's art therapy class was in session, the sound of gentle conversation mixing with the scratch of brushes on canvas. "You know," David continued, "when you first confessed at the courthouse, I thought it was the end of a nightmare, but it was really just the beginning of a greater testimony. Your journey of recovery is showing people that no one is beyond God's reach." James nodded, emotion flickering across his face. "I never thought I'd say this, but falling so far, it taught me what real grace looks like. Not the kind you just talk about in church, but the kind that meets you at rock bottom and loves you back to life." Together, they finished cleaning the dining hall, each lost in thoughts of how far they'd come. Through the windows, they could see new residents arriving for the evening check-in, each carrying their own hopes for transformation. The story of Hope Harbor continued to unfold, not despite James's betrayal, but somehow because of it. His testimony of grace had become part of the shelter's larger story, a living proof that no life was beyond redemption, no mistake too great for grace to overcome. 1 year after James's confession, David Thompson stood before the Pine Grove City Council, his heart racing with anticipation. The council chambers were packed with supporters, shelter residents, volunteers, local church members, and even some faces he didn't recognize. At his side stood James Riley, no longer the broken accuser, but a transformed man ready to help expand Hope Harbor's mission. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," David began, his voice clear and confident, "we're here today to propose something unprecedented in our community's history, the establishment of a second Hope Harbor facility, specifically designed to serve families in crisis." The presentation screens behind him displayed architectural renderings of the proposed shelter, a former motel on the east side of town that could be transformed into temporary housing units. But this was more than just a building project. It was the culmination of a year's worth of healing, growth, and divine inspiration. "The need is clear," James stepped forward, his professional background in finance now serving a higher purpose. "In the past year alone, we've had to turn away over 200 families due to space limitations. Each rejection represents children sleeping in cars, parents facing impossible choices, families being torn apart by circumstance." The council members leaned forward, their interest evident as James presented the detailed financial projections and community impact studies. This was the same man who had once fabricated documents to destroy Hope Harbor, now using his skills to expand its reach. Martha, sitting in the front row, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She remembered the late-night planning sessions in her kitchen where the vision for this expansion had first taken shape. The idea had come from an unexpected source, the very crisis that had nearly destroyed them. During the shelter's closure last year, David continued, we learned a harsh lesson about the fragility of our support systems, but we also witnessed something remarkable, the power of community to heal and rebuild. This new facility isn't just about providing beds, it's about creating a space where families can stay together while rebuilding their lives. The proposal detailed innovative programs designed specifically for families, educational support for children, parenting classes, job training for adults, and therapeutic services for all ages. Each element had been carefully planned based on the lessons learned through years of service at the original shelter. Jerome, now employed full-time as Hope Harbor's maintenance supervisor, stood to share his perspective. I came to Hope Harbor broken and alone. Now I have a job, a purpose, and a family in this community. But I've seen too many families turned away because we simply don't have the space to accommodate them. This expansion isn't just about buildings, it's about keeping families together during their hardest times. As the presentation continued, David couldn't help but marvel at how God had turned their greatest crisis into an opportunity for growth. The media attention that had once threatened to destroy Hope Harbor had ultimately brought their mission to a wider audience. Donations had increased, volunteers had multiplied, and support had grown far beyond Pine Grove's borders. Sarah, the young mother who had struggled during the shelter's closure, approached the podium with her children. When Hope Harbor closed last year, my family almost fell apart. The community center wasn't equipped to keep us together. But Hope Harbor didn't just give us a place to stay, they gave us a chance to heal as a family. Every family in crisis deserves that chance. The council members listened intently as more community members shared their stories. Clara spoke about the expanded financial literacy program she now led, helping families build sustainable futures. Thomas described how art therapy had helped children process trauma and maintain hope during difficult transitions. James stepped forward again, his voice steady with conviction. A year ago, I stood in a courthouse and confessed to trying to destroy this organization. Today I stand before you as living proof of its transformative power. This expansion isn't just about buildings and programs, it's about believing that every story can have a new chapter. The financial plan was solid, combining city funds with private donations and grants. Several local businesses had already pledged support, impressed by Hope Harbor's track record and inspired by its mission of transformation. The proposed location would serve a part of town that desperately needed these services. As David concluded the presentation, he shared a vision that went beyond mere expansion. Hope Harbor has always been more than just a shelter. It's a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of community, and the endless possibilities that emerge when we choose hope over despair. This new facility will allow us to extend that mission to countless more families in need. The council's deliberation was brief. The vote was unanimous. Hope Harbor would receive both the zoning changes and the funding support needed to proceed with the expansion. The chamber erupted in applause, but David noticed something more significant. The tears of joy on faces throughout the room, each person imagining the families that would be helped. Later that evening, as the sun set over Pine Grove, the Hope Harbor community gathered in the shelter's dining hall to celebrate. Martha's special occasion biscuits filled the air with their comforting aroma, while residents and staff shared their excitement about the expansion plans. David watched as James moved through the crowd, speaking with residents and volunteers, his humility and genuine care evident in every interaction. The transformation in him continued to inspire others, proving that no life was beyond redemption. Pastor, James approached David quietly. I never imagined that my greatest mistake would lead to something like this. God really does work in mysterious ways. David smiled, remembering his own dark night of questioning God's plan. That's the beauty of grace, James. It doesn't just heal our wounds, it transforms them into channels of blessing for others. As the celebration continued, David slipped away to his office for a moment of quiet reflection. On his wall hung a photograph of Hope Harbor's first day, 15 years ago. Beside it would soon hang the architectural renderings of the new facility, a testament to how far they had come and the journey still ahead. The expansion would bring new challenges, but David felt ready to face them. The crisis that had tested their faith had ultimately strengthened it, proving that God's plans were bigger than their greatest obstacles or their worst mistakes. Tomorrow would bring permit applications, construction plans, and countless details to manage. But tonight, hope filled the air like a tangible presence, reminding everyone that their story was still being written and its author had chapters yet to reveal. The morning of the new Hope Harbor Family Center's dedication dawned with a brilliance that seemed touched by divine grace. 18 months had passed since James's confession, and the transformed motel on Pine Grove's east side now stood as a testament to the power of redemption. Colorful balloons danced in the Texas breeze, while a banner stretched across the entrance proclaimed, "Hope Harbor Family Center, where grace builds new beginnings." David Thompson stood in the courtyard, watching as the gathering crowd grew. The space that had once been a rundown parking lot now featured a playground, community garden, and peaceful sitting areas. Inside, 25 family units waited to welcome their first residents, each equipped with everything a family would need to begin rebuilding their lives. "Can you believe it, Pastor?" Martha appeared at his side, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "From what almost destroyed us to this, only God could write such a story." Indeed, the journey from crisis to celebration had been remarkable. The crowd assembling for the dedication ceremony included faces from every chapter of Hope Harbor's story: current and former residents, volunteers, donors, and community leaders. Even some of the reporters who had once covered the scandal had returned, their cameras now ready to capture a very different kind of story. James Riley emerged from the building, his casual clothes a sharp contrast to the suits he'd worn during his days of addiction and deception. He had been instrumental in the new facility's development, working tirelessly to ensure every detail served the needs of families in crisis. The transformation in him remained one of Hope Harbor's most powerful testimonies. "Everything's ready inside," James reported, his face glowing with quiet joy. "The first families will be able to move in tomorrow morning." David nodded, remembering the long journey to this moment. The renovation had faced numerous challenges: permit delays, funding gaps, unexpected structural issues, but at each obstacle God had provided in unexpected ways. Local businesses had donated materials, skilled workers had volunteered their time, and the community had rallied with support that went far beyond financial contributions. As the ceremony's start time approached, David made his way to the podium set up in front of the main entrance. The crowd fell silent, their anticipation palpable in the morning air. 18 months ago, David began, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "I stood in a courthouse watching what I thought was the end of Hope Harbor's ministry. Today, we stand before a new beginning, one that proves God's plans are bigger than our greatest trials or our worst mistakes." He gestured to the building behind him. "This facility represents more than just brick and mortar. It embodies the truth that every story can have a new chapter. Every family deserves the chance to stay together while rebuilding their lives. Every crisis can become an opportunity for transformation." James joined him at the podium, his presence a living testimony to that truth. "A year and a half ago, I tried to destroy Hope Harbor," he addressed the crowd, his voice steady. "Instead, God used my worst actions to create something beautiful. This center exists because a community chose forgiveness over vengeance, hope over despair." The ceremony continued with various speakers sharing their parts in the story. Jerome spoke about the maintenance training program he now led, which had provided valuable job skills to residents during the renovation. Clara described the expanded financial literacy services that would help families build sustainable futures. Thomas unveiled a magnificent mural in the center's entrance hall, depicting the journey from brokenness to restoration. Sarah, now employed as the center's family services coordinator, shared her vision for the programs they would offer. "When my children and I needed help, Hope Harbor gave us more than shelter. They gave us a chance to heal together. Now, more families will have that same opportunity." As David listened to each testimony, he marveled at how God had woven their individual stories into a tapestry of grace. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead become the catalyst for expanded ministry, deeper community bonds, and countless new opportunities for transformation. Pastor Marcus stepped forward to offer the dedication prayer, his words carrying the weight of one who had witnessed the entire journey. "Lord, we stand in awe of how you have turned mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty. Let this place be a sanctuary of hope for families in crisis, a testament to your faithful love." After the ribbon cutting, guests toured the facility, expressions of wonder on their faces as they saw how the old motel had been transformed. Each family unit featured comfortable living spaces, private bathrooms, and kitchenettes. Common areas included a children's learning center, counseling rooms, and a communal dining hall where families could share meals and build community. In the center's chapel, a quiet space designed for reflection and prayer, David found James sitting alone, tears streaming down his face. "What's on your mind?" David asked gently, taking a seat beside him. "I keep thinking about that night," James replied. "When God showed me all the lives Hope Harbor had touched, I thought those visions were meant to convict me of my sins. But now I see they were also showing me the future. What could happen if I chose truth over lies, redemption over destruction?" David nodded, remembering his own dark night of questioning God's plan. Sometimes our greatest trials become the foundation for God's greatest works. Your story, James, your fall and restoration, has helped countless others find the courage to seek help, to believe in second chances. Outside, the celebration continued as the community explored the new facility. Children's laughter rang from the playground, while volunteers prepared a feast in the dining hall. Martha's biscuits filled the air with their familiar, comforting aroma, a reminder that some traditions would carry forward into this new chapter. "Tomorrow," David said, rising to his feet, "the first families will arrive, real people with real struggles, seeking hope in their darkest moments. And we'll be here to welcome them, to walk alongside them, to show them that transformation is possible." James stood as well, squaring his shoulders with newfound purpose. "Because we've lived it ourselves. Each of us has a story of God's faithfulness, especially in our lowest moments." Together, they walked back to join the celebration, passing the wall where photographs chronicled Hope Harbor's journey. The latest edition showed the entire community gathered during construction, covered in dust and paint, but beaming with joy. Former addicts working alongside business leaders, homeless veterans beside city officials, all united in the mission of hope. As the day drew to a close, David gathered the staff and key volunteers for a final prayer of dedication. "Lord," he prayed, "we stand in awe of your redemptive power. You took our moment of greatest trial and transformed it into an opportunity for expanded ministry. Let this place be a testimony to your faithful love, a sanctuary where broken lives are made whole." The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, its light touching the new facility with a golden glow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities for grace to work its miracle. But tonight, they celebrated the completion of a journey that had begun in darkness but emerged in glorious light. Hope Harbor's story had become more than a local testimony. It had spread far beyond Pine Grove, inspiring other communities to believe in the power of redemption and second chances. And at its heart stood the truth that God's plans, though often mysterious, were always greater than human understanding could grasp. As darkness fell and the last guests departed, David stood in the courtyard, his heart full of gratitude. The lights of both Hope Harbor facilities now shone in the distance, beacons of hope in a world hungry for transformation. The miracle was complete, yet somehow he knew this was just the beginning.